Hello. I've entitled this presentation The Sad Story of Evolution because when dealing with the theory of evolution, one can most certainly paraphrase the immortal words of one of my illustrious former fellow countrymen and say that rarely in the course of human history have so many been misinformed by so few on an issue that has such profound significance. Namely, can we be absolutely certain that our living world was created by God and therefore have no doubt whatsoever as to his existence? Or is it possible that there is a viable alternative explanation for life on Earth and that it developed naturally over time as the evolutionists would have us believe? You see, you don't need to be a brilliant scientist in order to appreciate just how impossible it would have been, for example, for the process that enables a caterpillar to transform into a butterfly to have developed gradually over time through an evolutionary mechanism, for the complex, all-new genetic information required to facilitate this amazing phenomenon to have accumulated over millions of years in what would have been an ongoing, unguided process. Oh yes, you could come up with some far-fetched ad hoc theory suggesting that one feature could have evolved into another and that function A gradually could have changed into function B, thus explaining how caterpillars developed the ability to turn into butterflies. However, that's not science, that's storytelling. Nevertheless, when people are told by scientists that it is a proven scientific fact that hearts, lungs, nervous systems and brains were all produced from scratch by genetic mutations and other genetic changes, it can sound quite convincing. Anyway, who wants to argue with science? That's why I feel it is so important to speak out on this issue. In this talk, I'm going to be looking at three of the best-known proofs for evolution that you can come across nowadays in the media, in textbooks, in museums. Proofs that I haven't mentioned in the other videos in this series, and that are, as you can see for yourselves, either speculation and wishful thinking, or completely irrelevant or totally spurious. However, before I start, I want to mention one other subject, and that is that we sometimes hear from rabbis and other scholars who say that Judaism has no problem with evolution. In other words, despite the fact that it contradicts a literal reading of the biblical account of creation, we can say that it happened, and somehow, from behind the scenes, either directly or indirectly, God was running the show over billions of years. I heard from one well-meaning rabbi who said that he was in a museum and he saw a reconstruction of a dinosaur with feathers. In other words, evidence that dinosaurs evolved into birds, and he said that we have no problem with that. One of my responses to these scholars is, how on earth can we say that Judaism has no problem with a theory that provided so much inspiration for the Nazis in general and for Hitler in particular? Can we incorporate into Judaism the idea that life on earth developed and progresses through natural selection, the survival of the fittest, the strong, the healthy, the superior, and through the demise of the weak, the sick, the starving, the inferior, the Jews, the blacks, the gypsies? Of course we have a problem with evolution. It's a theory that has abhorrent implications. So let's start out with what people see in museums and read about in textbooks. The idea that dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. This is one of the most popular claims in the whole evolution story. However, there are three things that most people are unaware of. Firstly, there are experts who are evolutionists who reject this whole idea. Secondly, there's no scientific evidence that it happened. How could there be empirical evidence for something that happened in the past witnessed by no one. And subjective interpretations of fossils and other phenomena do not convince the skeptics. More about that in a moment. And thirdly, and most important of all, it couldn't have happened because the anatomical differences between dinosaurs and birds are too significant even for evolution to have pulled this one off. Birds have unique lungs, specially designed to enable them to fly vast distances without suffering from fatigue. There is no way that evolution could have produced this system, and there is no way that the creatures could have survived while their lungs were being transformed. How would they have been able to breathe? Now, I must be careful what I say here because I was taken to task by a close relative of mine, because in the other videos in this series I use words like ludicrous, absurd, idiot, and she said it's not nice to talk like that. So what was good enough for Perry Como is going to be good enough for me. All I'm going to say is this: it's impossible. There is no way that birds could have evolved from other creatures. So what about all these feathered dinosaurs? Well, from what I understand, there may have been some species of dinosaurs that had feathers. However, many of these feathered dinosaurs that make the headlines come from an area in northern China where forgeries are rampant. However, even if they do find the fossil bones of some creature that looked as if it had been some sort of advanced dinosaur, it could be that these bones belonged to a unique extinct bird. And that brings us to what is perhaps the most famous missing link in the whole evolution story, Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx was for decades presented as a perfect proof for evolution, as here was a creature that had been part reptile, part bird. However, over the past 50 years or so, enthusiasm has waned, and there are experts who say that Archaeopteryx was a bird. It had feathers like modern-day birds, wings like birds, and a bird lung. But that is not what you will see in museums, read in textbooks, or hear from prominent evolution polemicists.
Without the feathers, this thing is more dinosaur than bird, and only because of feathers, creationists have to fit it in their narrow category. It's got to be a bird because it has feathers. Okay, that's the way they think. But you look closer, it's very clearly a dinosaur which feathers early on.
Proof number 2. E. coli bacteria can undergo some remarkable changes. They do, of course, remain bacteria, but these changes are presented as dramatic evidence for evolution. However, this is what one expert had to say about that.
I've been working with E. coli for over 10 years, published in the scientific literature. I've done all sorts of stuff with E. coli inside of animals, with genome sequencing, and looking at how it controls all of these genes. Well, you know, I think we are seeing changes, but it's not on the level that everybody sells it for. Everybody says E. coli can do this to prove evolution, and I look at it and I say, well no, this doesn't prove evolution. This really proves creation.
And finally, what is considered to be perhaps the most well-documented evidence of one creature turning into a completely different kind is whale evolution. Evolutionists have claimed since the time of Darwin that whales evolved from land-dwelling mammals, although the specific identity of their original ancestor is disputed. You can look at a website entitled Evolution, the Grand Experiment for an analysis of some of the false proofs used in the past for whale evolution. Now, whales do possess certain features that are similar to mammals, but sharks are genetically extremely similar to humans. You cannot infer from that we evolved from sharks. However, what is possibly the most popular claim to fame in this whole whale tale is this.
Go to a natural history museum which has a big whale skeleton hanging over the ceiling. If they did their job right behind the rib cage, look carefully, and you should see a couple of tiny bones hanging there. That's all that's left of their hip and their thigh bone. It's deeply buried inside their skeleton, has no use whatsoever. It's just a relic of their evolutionary past. It tells you whales once walked on land.
However, Dr. Kent Hovind, a rather outspoken creationists had a different explanation for these bones.
This textbook says, boys and girls, the whale has a pelvis. Now look at this, okay? Many organisms retain traces of their evolutionary history. For example, the whale retains pelvic and leg bones as useless vestiges. This textbook says, just imagine the whales walking around. It's true. Here's the bones they're talking about right there, folks. Just imagine the whale walking around. I'm sorry, I just can't imagine. This is a lie. That's not a whale's pelvis. Those little bones are anchor points that muscles attach to, and without those special bones and those special muscles, the whales cannot reproduce. It has nothing to do with walking on land. It has to do with getting more baby whales. So the authors that are writing this are either ignorant about their whale anatomy, or they are lying to your kids, trying to get you to believe a stupid theory. That is not a vestigial pelvis. That page ought to be torn out of the book.
So which explanation is correct? The creationists or the scientists? Surprise, surprise. Useless vestiges no more, researchers say. Now look what it says here. For decades, scientists assumed. What do you mean scientists assumed? They told us it was a scientific fact. You can't have a scientific theory that's based on all sorts of assumptions and wishful thinking. I think they call that pseudoscience, don't they? Actually, it's worth noting that Dr. Hovind presented the creationist explanation for these bones many years before this research was carried out, whereas Dr. Prothero presented the scientific explanation many months after the results of the research had been published. Actually, having watched all of Dr. Prothero's talk, What the Fossils Say, it's very clear that intellectual integrity is not one of his strong points. Be that as it may, this whole discussion is totally irrelevant because it couldn't have happened. Land creatures breathe through their noses and their mouths. Whales breathe entirely through a blowhole on the top of their heads. There is no way that this transformation could have taken place. And how on earth would the creatures have been able to breathe while the process was unfolding? So what would a famous evolutionist have to say about this? Well, this is a quotation from a website that provides information for school teachers who are teaching evolution. Evolutionary biologist Neil Shubin points out, in one sense, evolution didn't create anything new with whales. It was just tinkering with land mammals. It's using the old to make the new. Tinkering. Why didn't I think of that? Well, I'm not a famous evolutionist, so it never occurred to me. Okay, that's all for now. I have a lot more to say about the sad story of evolution, but I'm going to finish here. Shalom.